The cabin sat on the edge of the lake like it had been born from the earth itself. Weathered cedar planks, darkened by decades of rain and sun, leaned into one another in that imperfect way only hand-built homes do. The roof sagged slightly near the chimney, patched and repatched by my father's own hands, and the porch groaned under the weight of every footstep as though it remembered all who had walked it before. The lake stretched out in front of it, still and endless, its waters reflecting the shifting moods of the sky. To me, this place was more than timber and stone. It was the last remaining part of my father. He had built it in the years when money was scarce, but determination was not. Every nail, every carved joint had passed through his fingers. He used to say that the land didn't belong to us, we belonged to it. And I believed him. Growing up, weekends meant the cabin, the smell of smoke curling from the chimney, the quiet lap of water against the dock, the silence broken only by loons in the early morning. My father's voice carried across those woods, teaching me to fish, to split wood, to respect the stillness. When he died too early, the cabin became something heavier, a promise I had to keep, a place I swore to protect. Years slipped by. The world changed, but the cabin remained. Each visit felt like stepping into a photograph, colors slightly faded but still alive. Dust collected on the windowsills, spiderwebs filled the corners, but the spirit of my father clung to every wall. I'd sit on the porch sometimes for hours, listening to the creak of the boards, the whisper of the wind, the distant call of an owl. Grief never truly left, but it softened, reshaped into something steadier. Love and loss braided into the beams of that house. Then came the first letter. At first I thought it was a mistake. A plain envelope slid into my mailbox, embossed with the logo of the Homeowners Association from the nearby community across the ridge. I had never lived there, never bought into their manicured lawns or their strict bylaws. Their world stopped where my father's land began, or so I thought. The letter claimed otherwise. They argued that the cabin fell under their expanded jurisdiction, that the structure failed to meet updated compliance standards, that maintenance and permits had lapsed. In short, they suggested the cabin didn't belong to me in the way I believed. I crumpled the letter, but unease crept in. Bureaucracy has a way of sounding final, even when it's wrong. Their words, typed in cold legal font, clashed with the warmth of my memories. It was absurd to imagine that some board of strangers could decide the fate of a home that had been in my family for decades. Still, absurdity has a way of growing teeth. More letters followed, each one sharper, more insistent. Fines were mentioned. Seizure was whispered between lines. They warned of legal action, of forced compliance, of demolition if necessary. The tone was always the same, clinical, certain, as though they were reciting truths etched in stone. I knew they were bluffing. I knew the land was mine, but the language clawed at me in the quiet hours. What if they weren't bluffing? What if paper and ink could dismantle everything my father had built? I began to dig. At the county clerk's office, I sifted through deeds, maps, surveys yellowed with age. My father's handwriting appeared in margins, his name etched into records decades old. The cabin, the dock, the strip of woods, they were ours. More than that, the lake itself, its waters stretching into the horizon, had been secured under his name, a detail I had almost forgotten. Ownership of the land meant ownership of the water. The association, with all its polished documents and fine print, hadn't done its homework. They were trespassing in spirit long before they tried to trespass, in fact. I left the office that day with a stack of certified copies, my hands trembling with a mixture of anger and resolve. The cabin wasn't just protected, it was untouchable. My father had seen to that, yet anger alone couldn't shield it. When I drove back up to the ridge that evening, the sun was sinking behind the pines, casting the lake in firelight. The cabin stood against the blaze of the horizon, stubborn as ever, and I felt something shift inside me. They thought they could take it because they didn't understand it. To them it was just a piece of property, a structure on a map. To me it was blood, sweat, grief, and memory. It was the place where my father's presence still lingered in the smell of pine smoke and the echo of an axe striking wood. But the letters wouldn't stop, and I knew the association wouldn't either. People like that didn't retreat. They advanced until someone pushed back harder. Standing on the dock that night, water lapping against the wood, I looked across the darkened surface of the lake. The reflection of the cabin shimmered in the ripples. It was mine, all of it. And if they wanted to test how far they could reach, I was ready to show them how far I could stand. The fight was no longer about paperwork. It was about legacy. And legacy has a way of hardening a person. The second wave of letters didn't come gently. They arrived in thick envelopes, their weight deliberate, as though mass itself could intimidate. Each packet bulged with pages of bylaws, citations, and highlighted sections of rules I had never agreed to, written by people I had never met. At first, I read them in silence at the kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, the paper leaving smudges of ink on my fingertips. But by the third envelope, I stopped reading. Their words had become noise, an endless drone of authority trying to wear me down. It wasn't just the letters anymore. My phone began to ring with numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails from a woman with a clipped voice reminded me of pending enforcement actions. Then came the knocks, sharp, impatient raps at my door. One afternoon, I opened it to find a man in a windbreaker marked with the association's insignia. He had a clipboard, mirrored sunglasses, and the smirk of someone who believed the ground he stood on was already his. He pointed to the cabin in the distance, visible through the trees, and rattled off a string of violations as though reciting from memory. Roofline not to code. Dock in disrepair. Exterior unsightly. His voice was flat, mechanical, designed to intimidate. I didn't answer him. I let the silence stretch, the weight of my stare pressing harder than his words. Eventually he scribbled something on his clipboard, muttered under his breath, and left. But his presence lingered, like the stench of smoke after a fire. The association had made one thing clear. They weren't bluffing. I spent nights in the cabin, listening to the lake and the shifting timbers. The wind pressed against the walls, but the house held, just as it always had. Sitting by the fireplace, the glow washing across my father's old tools mounted on the wall, I tried to imagine what he would do. He had been a man who didn't bend easily. He believed in fairness, in work done by hand, in land cared for, not parceled and sold by committees. I imagined him standing on the porch, arms folded, staring down anyone who dared suggest they could take what was his. The thought steadied me, but reality has a way of pressing in. I couldn't ignore the risk. The association had money, lawyers, and influence. I had a deed and a memory, and though I knew the law was on my side, I also knew how easily truth can be buried beneath paperwork when the other side is relentless enough. I returned to the county office, this time requesting more than deeds. I asked for maps, surveys, even water rights documents. The clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw the dates, records stretching back nearly half a century, most of them in my father's name. Each document was another stone in the wall I was building, a defense that was more than emotional. It was ironclad, rooted as deep as the pilings of the dock itself. Back at the cabin, I organized everything into binders, the pages encased in plastic sleeves. Each time I slipped a document inside, it felt like adding armor. Yet even as the binders grew heavier, so did the weight pressing on me. The association wasn't going to vanish because of facts. They thrived on intimidation, on the exhaustion of those too weary to fight. They wanted me tired. They wanted me to give in. The first real crack in my composure came when I found a notice nailed to the cabin's door. It wasn't in an envelope. It wasn't mailed. It was posted like a warning, hammered straight into the wood of the porch beam. Bold letters declared final notice. They spoke of demolition, of seizure, of transferring ownership of abandoned or non-compliant structures. My hands trembled as I pulled it free, the nail splitting the fibers of the old cedar. For a moment, I just stared at the wound in the wood, the scar left behind. That was when the anger came. It wasn't loud. It didn't burn hot. It was slow, cold, deliberate. Standing there with the torn notice in my hand, I understood that they had made a mistake. They believed they were up against another homeowner who could be bullied into silence. But this wasn't about a house in a subdivision. This was about a cabin built by a man who had given everything he had to keep it standing. This was about a lake that had belonged to my family longer than the association had even existed. That night, I walked the shoreline under a rising moon. The water mirrored the stars, endless and indifferent to human disputes. I let the stillness of the lake steady me. My father's cabin, my father's land, my father's lake. The words became a rhythm in my mind, a vow. The next morning, I made calls of my own, not to lawyers, not to county officials, but to neighbors who remembered. People who had known my father, who had fished these waters, who had tied their boats to my family's dock. The association believed they held power through fear, but there was another kind of power: memory, loyalty, truth. And I had those on my side. The fight had shifted. No longer was it just me against an endless tide of paperwork. It was my father's legacy against the arrogance of strangers. And for the first time since the letters began, I felt something close to peace, because I knew the cabin wasn't standing alone. It began with trespassing. At first, small things. A car parked too close to the private drive, tire tracks pressed deep into the mud. Footprints by the dock that weren't mine. Cigarette butts left in the grass, their ash ground into the soil like careless signatures. I told myself it was coincidence, stray wanderers mistaking my land for public space. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't chance. This was pressure. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the tree line, I saw them. Two men in association jackets, clipboards in hand, standing on the cabin porch as though it belonged to them. They ran their fingers along the wood, jotted notes, snapped photographs. One tried the handle, tugging at the door like he had the right to enter. The audacity of it froze me where I stood on the path. For a moment I thought of my father, how he'd react if strangers dared touch his cabin. His fury would have been volcanic, unstoppable. I didn't shout. I didn't confront them. I watched silently until they noticed me, their postures stiffening when they realized they were caught. One muttered something, the other avoided my gaze. They shuffled off quickly, the gravel crunching beneath their boots as they made their retreat. But the damage was done. Their presence clung to the wood like a stain. The cabin no longer felt untouched. They had crossed the line from words into action. That night, sleep refused me. I sat in the cabin with the fire guttering low, the shadows creeping across the floorboards. Every groan of the timbers felt like a warning. My mind replayed the sight of their hands on the door handle, their pens scratching against paper. They weren't just threatening now. They were measuring, planning, preparing. The next morning, another notice appeared, this time taped to the dock. Its words carried no subtlety. The cabin was non-compliant. Demolition was scheduled within 60 days. My stomach tightened as I read. The notice spoke with authority, with finality, as though my ownership meant nothing. It dared me to prove otherwise. I walked the shoreline with the paper crumpled in my fist. The lake was still, a sheet of silver beneath the rising sun. Ducks drifted near the reeds, unbothered by human disputes. I stopped at the far edge where the trees bent low, their roots clutching the soil like claws. My father had once told me that lakes remember. They hold every ripple, every stone thrown, every storm endured. Standing there, I realized this fight wasn't about their timeline. It was about mine, and my timeline stretched back decades. That day, I gathered every document I had collected and drove into town. At the county courthouse, I spread them across the clerk's desk like a general laying out maps of war. Deeds, surveys, water rights, all with my father's name, all signed and sealed long before the association existed. The clerk studied them, her brows furrowing, her fingers tracing the embossed stamps of authenticity. When she looked up, her words carried the weight I needed. They don't have jurisdiction here. I left the office with more than paper. I left with confirmation. The cabin wasn't just safe, it was beyond their reach. The lake was mine, the shoreline mine, the cabin mine. Their notices were smoke without fire. Yet I knew smoke has a way of spreading if left unchallenged. So I began documenting everything. I photographed the trespassers, recorded their vehicles, cataloged each notice. I kept journals of dates, times, even the weather when they appeared. Every detail became ammunition. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one they couldn't win. But anger alone wasn't enough to carry me through the nights. Doubt still crept in, whispering what ifs. What if they ignored the law? What if they used force? The thought of bulldozers tearing through my father's cabin haunted me like a recurring nightmare. I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, sweat cooling on my skin, the imagined sound of splintering wood echoing in my ears. Then one evening, as twilight bled across the lake, a strange calm settled over me. I sat on the dock with my feet dangling in the water, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. The cabin stood behind me, its windows glowing with firelight. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt my father in the stillness, in the creak of the boards, in the hush of the trees. His presence was undeniable, woven into the land itself. And in that moment, I knew the truth. The association could threaten, could bluff, could trespass. But they couldn't erase him. They couldn't erase me. The line had been crossed. And now, it was my turn to answer. The first frost of autumn glazed the grass when I realized just how much leverage the lake gave me. Mist rolled low across its surface at dawn, shrouding the cabin like a secret whispered back through time. The water carried reflections of the ridge, of the trees bending heavy with the weight of the season's change. To the association, it was just a body of water, a scenic backdrop for property listings. But to me, it was the anchor, the undeniable proof that their reach ended where my father's foresight began. I sat at the kitchen table that morning with maps spread wide, the smell of coffee thick in the air. The deed didn't just outline the cabin and the dock. It traced the lake's full boundary, a perimeter that wrapped around their prized community like a noose. The water was mine, legally, historically, irrevocably. They had built their walking trails and picnic areas along its shore, sold lakeside lots to families craving beauty, advertised it in glossy brochures. And yet every reflection on that water, every ripple stirred by their children's stones, every fish pulled from its depths, it all belonged to me. That knowledge shifted something deep inside me. Their threats no longer pressed against me. They pressed against themselves. Each notice, each trespass, each photograph of my cabin, they were building their case on land they didn't control, water they couldn't touch. It was like watching someone build a house of cards on a table you could pull away at any second. The cabin walls seemed to breathe easier as I sorted the documents into neat stacks. My father's handwriting scrawled across margins of old surveys stared back at me, his voice echoing from decades past. Always think 2 steps ahead. He had done exactly that when he secured the lake. What they thought was vulnerability was, in truth, their blind spot, but realization alone wasn't enough. The association was relentless, sending letters now twice a week, plastering compliance warnings on my gate, dropping voicemails laced with bureaucratic menace. Their confidence dripped from every word, as though they believed inevitability was on their side. I knew they wouldn't stop until I made them, so I devised a plan, not anger-driven but deliberate. I returned to the county office, retrieved fresh copies of the lake rights, and requested certified seals on every page. From there, I scheduled a quiet meeting with the sheriff's department, laying the documents out for their review. The deputy leaned back in his chair, lips pressed thin, and finally nodded. "If they step foot on your dock again, call us," he said. "They've got no authority out there." Driving back up the ridge that evening, the world seemed sharper. The smell of pine, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires, the shimmer of the lake in the fading light, all of it pulsed with a renewed sense of protection. The association wanted to play at authority. I had law, land, and legacy bound together in my favor. That night, I walked the shoreline with a lantern in hand, the beam cutting through mist that clung low to the water. Each step crunched against frost-hardened earth. The air carried the metallic tang of cold, the faint smoke of the fire burning inside the cabin. I stopped halfway around, looking back across the water at the silhouettes of homes on the opposite shore. Porch lights glowed in neat rows, artificial stars lined up with uniformity. They had built their lives on an illusion, unaware of how fragile it all was. One piece of paper could shatter it. My piece of paper. For a moment, I felt almost sorry for them, the families who thought the association protected them, who trusted its authority without question. But sympathy had its limits. Their president, their enforcers, their polished notices. They had chosen aggression. They had chosen to cross the line. Standing there with the lantern's glow spilling into the water, I made my decision. I wouldn't just defend the cabin. I would remind them whose reflection truly rippled across this lake. They wanted to flex control? I would show them what control really looked like. The lake remembered my father's hands pulling fish from its depths. his laughter echoing over morning fog, the weight of his boots pressing into the dock. And now it would remember me, not as the man who yielded, but as the one who carried his legacy forward. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. And for the first time, I was ready not just to protect, but to strike back. The association's arrogance reached its peak on a Sunday morning. I woke to the sound of engines, not the quiet hum of fishing boats, but the growl of utility trucks rolling heavy across the gravel road. From the cabin porch, I saw them. 3 vehicles lined along the shore, men in reflective vests unloading tools and orange stakes. They were marking the ground, hammering posts into soil that wasn't theirs. I walked closer, boots crunching against frost-stiff grass, and watched as they planted survey flags along the bank. Their leader, an officer of the association, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, pointed toward my dock as though giving orders. That dock had stood for 50 years, boards replaced by my father's hands, nails driven with care and sweat. Now strangers were circling it like scavengers. They didn't look up at first. They thought their presence was unquestioned. But when I stepped onto the shoreline, the man with the clipboard froze. His eyes flicked to me, then back to his crew, his lips curling into something between annoyance and false authority. He raised the clipboard as though it were a shield, but I didn't need to hear his words. The gesture alone screamed of someone who thought paper outweighed truth. I stood silent for a long moment, letting the weight of my presence do what their notices couldn't. Then slowly, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the certified documents, the deeds, the maps, the water rights, all stamped and sealed by the county. I held them up, the pages catching the pale light of morning. "You're on private property," I said finally, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the still air. The words landed heavier than I expected. One of the workers shifted uncomfortably, his hammer dropping against the rocks. The clipboard man tried to recover, tried to muster that same bureaucratic tone I'd heard in their letters. But his confidence faltered, because unlike paper threats, this was reality. This was me, standing on the shoreline of a lake that belonged entirely to my family. When I told them the sheriff was a phone call away, silence fell. The workers avoided my eyes, gathering their tools with hesitant motions. The clipboard man lingered, his jaw tightening, his pride unwilling to bend even as the ground shifted beneath him. But eventually, he too retreated, climbing back into his truck with a final glare. The engines roared again, wheels spitting gravel as they disappeared up the ridge. The lake returned to silence. Only the soft lapping of water against the dock remained, steady, eternal. I stood there for a long time, papers still in my hand, watching the ripples stretch outward. It was more than a victory. It was the turning point. News travels fast in small places. By evening, neighbors were calling. Word had spread that the association had tried to stake claims they didn't own and been sent packing. Some spoke with quiet admiration, others with relief, as though my stand had given them courage. The association thrived on intimidation, but intimidation withers when someone finally refuses to bend. That night, I sat by the fireplace in the cabin, the flames throwing long shadows across the walls. My father's tools hung in their familiar place, steel glinting in the light. I thought of him again, not just as the man who built this cabin, but as the man who prepared for this very battle long before I could see it coming. He hadn't left me land and water by accident. He had left me a shield, forged in foresight. I realized then that the lake wasn't just mine. It was a witness. It had seen my father's labor, his laughter, his stubborn refusal to yield. And now it had seen me, standing on its edge, protecting what was ours. The water had turned against them, not with violence, but with memory, with law, with truth too heavy to erase. The association would come again. I knew that. People drunk on power never surrender easily. But from now on, every step they took would be on uncertain ground. Every threat they made would echo back at them across a lake that remembered. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about legacy, about proving that no piece of paper, no clipboard, no self-appointed council could ever erase the weight of history carved into this land and water. And as I watched the fire crackle, the wind pressing against the cabin walls, I understood. They had mistaken me for a man standing alone. They had forgotten the lake. The lake was mine. The cabin was mine, and I was done being quiet.